Hello, me and Henry are at the Warwick EU referendum debate, and we are joined by Toby Young, the Associate Editor of the Spectator and Telegraph Journalist. Toby, how are you?
I'm okay.
Did you enjoy the debate? How do you think it went?
Yeah, I thought it was quite lively. The audience seemed very engaged and pretty well informed. It was the second time I've debated Hugo, and we're going to debate each other again in a couple of weeks in Paris. But no, I always enjoy this kind of thing.
Were you shocked by the immediate poll results at the start? Showing, I think it was 75% of students here vote. We're going to vote in about 30%.
It is the Europe Society, isn't it? Isn't this the first event of the Europe Society?
This is the European Society, so not specifically
Society.
an EU society, but I suppose a European culture society.
You wouldn't expect to win a debate about Brexit in the European Society, so I wasn't too shocked by the result.
If Brexit goes ahead, will Mr Cameron's position as Prime Minister be untenable?
Yeah, I think that's very hard to predict. The sort of conventional wisdom is that he'd find it very hard to cling on if Brexit wins. But the question will turn, I think, on whether there is a credible alternative Prime Minister in the wings. And it seems to me that the most prime ministerial person on the Brexit side is Michael Gove. But Michael Gove is also very loyal, and I think feels quite conflicted about being on the opposite side of this debate to David Cameron. So I don't think he'd make a move against Cameron in the event of Brexit winning. Boris might, but only if he thought he could definitely win. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. And in politics, one thing I've discovered from having made lots of very confident predictions myself in the past is that it's very unpredictable, and often what something turns on is quite hard to anticipate, and it's often quite surprising.
So, in terms of the actual Tory party, the Conservative Party, do you think they will fully recover from this issue? I know it's been an issue that has been in the party for ages, but now this actual referendum has sort of split them with the whole Ian Duncan-Smith resignation, and there seems to be a clear sort of dichotomy there. Do you think they will recover to the sort of party they were, united?
I think it would be more of a risk for the Conservative Party to have held the referendum in this Parliament, given how divisive it's been, if Jeremy Corbyn wasn't the leader of the Labour Party. But I just find it inconceivable that a Corbyn-led Labour Party would win in 2020. And it looks unlikely at this point that Corbyn will go before 2020.
Labour, though.
I tried to join to vote for Corbyn. I tried to become an associate member. I can't remember exactly what the terminology was now.
And you were filtered out?
I was
Sherlock Holmes.
I was winkled out, and I got a very snarky email from someone in Labour HQ saying they were keeping my money, but I wouldn't be allowed to vote. But you didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out that my motives were a bit mischievous, because in the form online where it asks why you wanted to become an associate member, I put to consign Labour to electoral oblivion. and I now actually have kind of I'm having not the only one, I'm having a bit of buyer's remorse about Corbyn. He's been too effective, I think, at destroying the Labour Party. I mean, I hope actually just to make Labour lose the next general election, and not to consign the party to the dustbin of history. But I'm now beginning to think that Corbyn's leadership will be so disruptive that Labour will never recover.
Just moving back to the EU, if Brexit were to take place, do you think that this would have an adverse effect on the institution moving forwards? And if it was to have an adverse effect, would this negatively affect Britain? So looking at political instability, lack of trade agreements, that sort of thing.
Well, again, it's very hard to predict.
Yes.
But I think it's just as likely that it would have a positive effect. Hugo talked in the debate about the need to reform the EU, and many people on the Remain side sort of want to have their cake and eat it by saying they're not defending the EU in its present state, but they imagine a future in which a reformed EU would be very attractive. But we saw when David Cameron tried to renegotiate the terms of Britain's membership that the EU is extremely resistant to any reform, not least because it's really hard to get 27 other heads of state, all with their own kind of domestic political constituencies, to agree to a reform. And that's one of the reasons it's so difficult for the EU to conclude any trade agreements with places like China and America. And actually the only way to get the EU to embark upon meaningful reform might be the shock of Brexit, whereby they recognise that their dream, the Federalists recognise that the dream of a more integrated Europe is over, and it might then return to being a kind of glorified customs union.
You said then about David Cameron's renegotiation, and I was wondering, it seems that you don't attribute that sort of failure to Cameron. You just see the EU as sort of unreformable. So do you not think if any other, I don't know, say Boris Johnson, who's more Eurosceptic, went to the table, do you think he would have got more, or do you think that was just impossible under this current EU?
No, I think they were nervous about granting any concessions to the UK because inevitably other non-Eurozone EU member states would want the same deal. But I also think that they're confident that the British people will vote to remain, and so didn't feel they needed to make any concessions in order to secure that result. And I think they just take for granted Britain's membership of the EU. And I think the worrying thing is that if we vote to remain, having been offered so little, that in future the threat that Britain may one day leave the EU, which is one of the ways in which Britain has been able to secure some of the protections like the rebates and the veto and so forth, if that threat is found to be empty, which it will if we vote to remain, then I can easily see those protections being eroded in the quite near future.
And just to finish off, how would you respond to the argument that Brexit would only be a victory for nationalists and the uber-rich, which has been put forward, I think it was by the Greek Prime Minister in an article in The Guardian? It's hard to deny that a swathe of Brexit opinion is down to immigration fears.
I don't think Brexit would necessarily benefit the uber-rich. And actually, if you look at the people who've lined up on the Remain side, many of them are very rich.
Okay,
all the money
rich,
seems to be on the Remain side. Like Goldman Sachs, for instance, is very keen on Remain.
I think looking less from a company perspective and more an individual private perspective.
No, I think people on my side of this debate believe that wages will go up, food prices will fall. Actually, people at the lower end of the income spectrum will benefit, not suffer, if we leave the EU. A triumph of nationalism. It's kind of part of the credo of the European Union that nationalism is evil. It led to 2 world wars, and one of the reasons we have to pool sovereignty and identify more with international institutions like the UN and the EU is as a counterweight to the toxic potential of nationalist movements. I don't agree with that. The system of nation states before the outbreak of the First World War managed to maintain the peace in Europe for 100 years. I think nationalism can easily be a force for good. I don't think feeling patriotic and feeling a sense of belonging and identity in your particular country is bad. And actually, I think the risk of nationalism declining as a source of identity is that people become much more prone to toxic international ideologies. The notion that international ideological movements are somehow benign and that nationalist ideological movements are toxic, I think is just, wrong. International socialism, for instance, which ultimately was responsible for many more deaths than fascism, was an international ideology. Islamism, which is claiming lots of disaffected young men in cities like Coventry, is an internationalist ideology. So I don't buy the idea that nationalism is just bad and internationalism is always good. And I think actually, just as some international institutions can serve as a counterweight to some of the more toxic aspects of nationalism, so nationalism can serve as a useful counterweight to some of the more toxic elements of internationalism.
If I could just make two final brief points. Firstly, do you think Barack Obama has the right to put his position on the EU and persuade the British people to vote one way or other? And secondly, I noticed that you're sporting a beard. Is that in response to, are you not going to shave that off until Britain leaves the EU?
No, there's no story behind it. I think Obama is, of course he has the right to express his point of view, but so too do the British people have the right to ignore it. And I do think that he was making the case for Remain because he thinks it's in America's interests. Sorry, I've got a slightly sore throat. He thinks it's in America's interests for Britain to remain within the EU because Britain is America's closest ally, and if we remain in the EU, then the EU is going to be closer as a whole to America. So I can understand why he made the case, but I don't think that means it's in our interests to remain in the EU.
Brilliant. Toby Young, thank you very much, and I hope your vocal cords remain intact for the rest of the campaigning period.
Thank you. My name's Toby Young, and you're listening to Perspectives.